Recently, I was invited on a trip to the Holy Land by a good friend of mine, Father Gilbert Medina, to join a group that was traveling, going around to the different sites in the Holy Land. And the purpose of my being there was to provide a resource for the history of the Crusades. So, as we would go from site to site, I would discuss the relevant Crusades history to that particular site. And of course, if you've been to the Holy Land, if you've been to Jerusalem, you know that Crusades history is everywhere, so it's great. The people in the group, they were very eager to learn about the history of the Crusades. One question that several people asked me as we were traveling around was, so what was the difference between a Crusader and a Templar? So I wanted to do a video that would just address this very basic issue. Crusaders, Templars. What's the difference? So first of all, I think it'd be helpful to define the Crusades. So what was a crusade? In the chatter on the internet, you'll get all sorts of people coming up with their own definition of the Crusades. None of that matters. 21st century opinions about what was a crusade doesn't matter, because people in the Middle Ages, Latin Christians, Christians of the West and Central Europe who adhered to the Latin Church, that is the church headed by the Pope in Rome, they had a very clear definition about what was a crusade, and they were the ones doing the Crusades. This is where Crusade history comes from. They had a very clear and concise definition of what constituted a crusade. That's what matters. So the definition that medieval people had for a crusade, it was this. It was any war, any military campaign that was deemed by the papacy, so deemed by the Pope, to be spiritually meritorious. Centuries before the Crusades began, St. Augustine came up with this idea of just war, or he clarified the idea of Christian just war. The King of France and the King of England, one of them might have just cause to go to war with the other, but they're both Christian princes, so a war between them can never be spiritually meritorious. Now, a crusade, let's say some non-Christian power, the Fatimids of Egypt or the Seljuk Turks, have control of Jerusalem, and an army of Christian knights set out to take control of Jerusalem from them, to liberate Jerusalem as Latin Christians would have perceived it. This is something that can be spiritually beneficial in the eyes of God. So that means the warriors taking part in this campaign, they can gain spiritual benefits from taking part in it, an indulgence. So with this definition of a crusade, we see that a lot of campaigns throughout the 12th century, the 13th century, and beyond fall into this category of a crusade, because the popes were designating a lot of wars as crusades. The campaigns in Spain, the Albigensian Crusade, of course, the Baltic Crusades against these Baltic pagan groups, and as well as the campaigns in the Holy Land. So having defined a crusade, I think we get a better idea of who a crusader was. A crusader was someone who took a vow to go on crusade. So took a vow to engage in a particular campaign that had been designated as a crusade by the Pope. So a crusader's vow, it has a couple of elements. First of all, it has a penitential element. That is, a crusader vowed to renounce sin, to turn away from sin, and to embrace the way of Christ. Secondly, a crusader vows to complete this mission. So he's going to go on this campaign, whether it's in Spain, the Baltic, the Holy Land, engage in this struggle with his fellow crusaders against this enemy of Christendom, whatever it might be, the Moors, a pagan Baltic tribe, the Fatimids of Egypt, whatever. The vow that a crusader took, it's very closely related to the vow that would have been taken by a pilgrim. Crusading evolved out of this practice of pilgrimage, so this practice that goes back to the earliest years of Christianity, in which a Christian would travel to a spiritually significant site, especially the holy places in like Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Jerusalem in particular. This is the site of the Holy Sepulchre, the place where Christ died and then rose again from the dead. The First Crusades, the campaign that got all this started, it took place between 1096 and 1099. Those men who went on that campaign, they took a vow of pilgrimage. So they were acting as pilgrims. They were traveling from Germany, France, Italy, to the Holy Land to reverence Jerusalem. So they took this vow to pray at this most holy of sites in Christendom, to reverence this place where Christ had died and risen. But they took another vow. They took a vow as soldiers to fight in the Holy Land to overcome the non-Christian power that had control of Jerusalem, to liberate Jerusalem and restore it to Christian rule, to make it safe for Christians. And we know that leading up to this period, the Seljuk Turks, who had control of Jerusalem shortly before the Crusaders arrived and the Fatimids had it, they were creating problems. They were attacking Christian pilgrims. So they were taking this vow both to liberate the holy places, but also to protect their fellow Christians. The rhetoric of the First Crusade from Pope Urban II and various preachers he dispatched to spread the message of the Crusade, it was filled with this idea of bringing aid to the Christians of the East and protecting Christian pilgrims. So the Crusade, the vow of the Crusader, it contains this act of love, this idea of Christian charity. So not only are you acting out of love of God, but you're acting out of love of your Christian neighbor. So I think at this point we've defined a Crusader in pretty clear terms. So now let's move on to a Templar. Who was a Templar? So the Templars come later than Crusaders, but they evolve out of crusading. The Templars come into existence as a direct result of the success of the First Crusade. So here's the situation after the First Crusade. They established this kingdom, the kingdom of Jerusalem. So it's a small kingdom right there in Palestine, centered around Jerusalem. And after the First Crusade ends and is successful, the vast majority of the army returns home. So these men had made this vow to crusade. They'd fulfilled their vow. So now they were going home. What was left behind was several hundred knights and infantry to act as the standing army for this kingdom. So this was a very precarious situation because this is far away from the main territories of Christendom. They are surrounded by Saracen kingdoms. For pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land in these early decades after the First Crusade, it was still very precarious. The roads were dangerous for traveling. So what happens? So a group of knights led by a Frenchman by the name of Hugh of Payenne from the Champagne region, they decide while they are on pilgrimage in Jerusalem to address this issue. They form a brotherhood of knights who are committed to ideas that are closely associated with monasticism at this time: poverty, chastity, obedience, and they agree to live in community. But they take another vow. They take a vow to defend the holy places and to defend pilgrims traveling through the Holy Land, so to defend Christians. So this is a new thing. This is the birth of the military orders. This is kind of a combining of the idea of a knight and a monk to address a need. You know, as a result of the Crusades, the holy places need protection, and there are not enough knights in the area to protect it. Hugh of Payenne and his brothers, they were trying to address that need. So this first group of Templars, they established their base at the Temple Mount. Today you can go there, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is there. At that time, that mosque was being used as the royal palace of the Christian king of Jerusalem. He gave Hugh a wing of that palace to be the headquarters of this band of knights. And so that's where they get their name. They are based at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. They exist to protect Jerusalem. They're closely associated with Jerusalem and the temple. They are the Knights Templar. The Templars start off as a small group dependent on charity. Very quickly they evolve into a large international organization with estates all over Christendom and the resources to field very large armies in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They became a very large order, one of the largest religious orders of the 12th and 13th centuries. But they were a new type of order. You know, unlike the Cistercians or the Dominicans, they were fighters. They were fighting monks in a sense. So they had a dual mission to dedicate themselves to the communal living of monks, but also to defend Christendom, to act as knights in defense of the holy places and Christian people. So I hope that kind of clarifies the difference between just a Crusader and a Templar. A Crusader, this is someone who vows to engage in a crusade, but the vow of the Templar is a permanent vow, like one that would be taken by a monk. He vows to dedicate his life to this, to give up his own will and his own property and live in community with his fellow Templars and commit himself to this mission of defending Christendom. Now, of course, Templars were not the only military order of the Middle Ages. Everybody knows about the Hospitallers, mostly, another military order which also had this mission of providing medical treatment to pilgrims. And then, of course, the Teutonic Knights, who were kind of almost a German version of the Templars. They were heavily involved in the Northern Crusades in the Baltic, and there were other military orders beyond these three, although these three were the biggest. So that right there, that's my little spiel about how we define a Crusader versus a Templar. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. The only reason I've got my guitar in this video is just because this is my favorite electric guitar, actually. This is my Telecaster USA. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'll talk to you soon.
It's never even enough. It's these dark moments when we might wake up